So good evening and welcome to the second installment of our study of Khenchen Palden Sherab's Opening the Wisdom Door of the Middle Way. And I call this study, these webinars, Understanding Wisdom, because wisdom in Buddhism is not something that it's not something we learn. With wisdom, we actually means the insight that cuts through self-deception. So first of all, it's something entirely universal. It's definitely not something that we can call Buddhist. It's something that's part of our phenomenology. It's part of who we are. But what the Buddha discovered is who we are very much depends on the degree of our delusion. And that delusion has nothing to do with intellectual understanding and ideas. It's just the degree to which our subjectivity is clouded, is afflicted by attachment, aversion, ignorance. Again, things that have nothing to do with doctrine or culture or anything, but are just basic to our, you could say, disposition as humans. And the Buddha discovered that our basic delusion lies in this grasping on to thinking of me and thinking of other, what we then call duality, on a very basic level. But then also there's lots of, you could say, human doctrines that try to justify or substantiate or find meaning, as we call it, in terms of our subjective experience, in terms of the other. And that sort of adds additional layers of confusion and artificial ideas. What the Buddha did was strip down to the naked experience, and in doing so he discovered within our disposition a core that is completely without confusion. And so in approaching the entire Buddhist path, it's very important that we understand that when we say wisdom, we're not about learning some quotes or learning some Buddhist ideas, but we're about going down into the depth of our being. And in this context, then, it's helpful if we can weed out some of the inevitable misunderstandings that take place. So there is, in the context of Madhyamaka, and in the context of what the Buddha taught, there's a lot of stress on discerning, insight, what we call prajna, the ability to see through deception. And that is what we're doing. Obviously, this is not easy. But I would say in doing this, we don't necessarily have to think of this as an overly ambitious project, because we are fortunate in that we live in a time where the Buddha's teaching exists and where there are great persons that uphold this teaching. There are many teachings that have been taught down through the ages of Buddhism. We can draw on this. We can stand on the shoulders of these giants. And that's what we're doing here. But in terms of us approaching the path, then it's valuable if we have some, what we call, view. So that's what we're doing here. And it's then presently understanding the view as it was expounded by some great sages. And inevitably we are going to be talking about some names, some categories, some classifications. You know, anybody who looks at this title, the Svatantrika Madhyamaka of Shantarakshita, who's not familiar with this, of course would say, oh, that's rather incomprehensible, doesn't seem familiar. But as with anything, if we're going into homeopathy, if we're going into the allopathic traditions of the West, if we're going into Chinese medicine, whatever it is we go into, yes, all we're doing is restoring the natural health of the body, but we are doing it within a particular system. So we are using some remedies that have particular names, labels, and so forth, but we're restoring what is already innate to us. So that's an important understanding then when we are approaching these this particular system, yes, it does come with a few labels and a few aspects of, you could say, tradition, information, and so forth. All right, so let's go ahead with this. I'm going to cut the video, and then here. Now, as we undertake this different from your average classroom situation, this is about enlightenment. And so when we generate this intention to study the middle way, it is to gain this kind of wisdom I was just alluding to. And it's also then important to appreciate that this wisdom then is something that's relevant. It's, like I said, it's basic to the phenomenology of our consciousness. It's basic to universal experience. And so what we're doing here is addressing the suffering we see in the world in general. And so in that we recognize the universal relevance of what we're doing. We don't just think of this as our own little private journey, but it's something that really is about the world, the real world out there, and why there is suffering. And unless we are completely aware of that, then we're just going to think, though, I'm doing my Buddhist thing. And you could say, that's fine, but that's a very small thing, and we end up doing small stuff for ourselves. So the Mahayanists say, emphasize this, generating the motivation of bodhicitta, where we are about assisting the world at large. We're not going to creep into our own little nirvana. We're about eradicating the confusion that is universally present in the consciousnesses that we would refer to as sentient beings. So we vow, now that we have a remedy for this, to never abandon any sentient being, and in fact now push through to an awakening from this condition of being a sentient being to becoming a Buddha. So we specifically then generate this motivation. I will study and integrate the middle way teaching to bring all sentient beings to perfect enlightenment. Now that's then what we do. We do it here, we do it when we do meditation practice. And in fact, anything that we do in life, if we have that kind of motivation to begin with, we might or might not succeed with whatever we're doing, but if we can trust the motivation that we go into any given situation, this can save us a lot of insecurity as we engage in a situation, and it also will eliminate that we have regret at the end of the situation. So this generating this motivation of bodhicitta has such immense and universal benefit. Now, last time we then established the lineage where this comes from the Buddha, Nagarjuna, Buddhapalita, Bhaviveka, Chandrakirti, Shantarakshita, and Kamalashila as some of the Indian lineage masters, and then more specifically then this topic that we're studying here, the Svatantrika Madhyamaka, according to the Nyingma masters, draws very much on these three lineage masters, what we would call Ronglong Namni, the two, Rong and Long, which is Rongzom Pandita and Longchen Rabjam, and then as this comes down to Jamgun Mipham Rinpoche. And so in fact, the work that we're studying here is very inspired by Jamgun Mipham, who in turn were inspired by the two others. And to just go over what we touched on last time, when we speak about Madhyamaka in general, and this we're going to be returning to again and again because that is the key of what we're doing really, is this this middle way. And if we understand that, we actually understand what Buddhism is about. So the absolute Madhyamaka is something we should understand as the freedom from grasping at innate confusion. This means a freedom from our own personal confusion, and also what we could call acquired dogma, the belief systems that we then might bolster our insecurity with, or somehow you could say the conceptual belief systems that we lean to, and we take as sort of crutches for our insecurity and our sort of fear of the world. So much of, you could say, the philosophical project, of course, is genuine inquiry, but also a lot of it is about, it's caught up inevitably within cultural or dogmatic existing belief systems. And what the Buddha proposed is we could be free from that altogether. All of this really ends up being ideas that we objectify. Innate attempts at objectifying and solidifying our subjective dimension, and with that also the experience of the outer grasped object, but also then all the dogmas and ideas, philosophical positions that seem to consolidate the true existence of a subjectivity, of an external world. So that freedom altogether, enlightenment, if you like, is what we call absolute Madhyamaka. But we also have then the scriptural Madhyamaka, and that's what we're doing here. And that is then a path where we actually reflect and we think critically, and we establish some understanding of where confusion comes from, and then we do something about it, which is then the path of meditation. So scriptural Madhyamaka is then the path of reasoning, and then the path that leads to that here means then the absolute Madhyamaka. Last time then we talked about two kinds of Madhyamaka. The one is, and this really just is you could say the absolute Madhyamaka is the same, but as far as the scriptural Madhyamaka, we have two approaches. They come with different language, and these are the Prasangika and the Svatantika Madhyamaka. The Prasangika means the consequentialists, and they're the ones who don't really say anything. They just expose the flaws of those who cling to dogma, and of course also clinging to the innate ignorance. But that is a rather advanced approach. So the Prasangika Madhyamaka is something that introduces then this absolute perspective and also how it's applied. The Svatantrika Madhyamaka additionally expounds on the relative perceptions according to the Yogacarya mind-only approach. That is what we talked about last time, how relative truth is explained according to the Yogacarya model, which actually the Prasangikas don't even take really much of a view in some sense. They refute some of the positions of the Yogacarya, but they would, in terms of just understanding the relative world, they would actually agree with the Yogacarya, but they just would say there's no, that mind which projects has no absolute truth in itself. Anyway, we're not about this. This is something that we'll be returning to. And also I would say check out you're going to have to some of these things, if they're confusing, it's nothing that is not explained in the book that we're studying, and it's also something that if you go over what we studied last time, it should be quite straightforward. In general, what Madhyamaka does is it refutes. It exposes, it has a methodology of exposing the shortcomings. And when we say refutation, it's something that we're familiar with. Refutation is quite simply to disprove an assumption that's not valid. For example, we might say, somebody might say, well, water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. And we say, and then they might say, well, that's the truth. That's an absolute truth. And then you could say, yeah, that's maybe true, but that doesn't apply if you're up in elevated heights. Like if you go up in several thousand meters, then actually water boils at, let's say, 98 or whatever. It boils at lower than 100 degrees. And that's not something about belief. You see, there you could actually prove it directly, and you could also perhaps draw up some mathematical equations that would substantiate that. But both, you could say, experientially and logically, you can disprove that. And see, there we're not talking about belief. We're talking about a refutation that disproves. And that's where like the Kempo here says, if you then keep on clinging to your position after it's been proven, then you're just stubborn. And you're deceiving yourself. So refutation is about proof. It's about acquiring a clear position. And that's very important. That's what we do with the Madhyamaka. It's not as if Buddhists, they believe in emptiness. It's not as if Buddhists believe in the middle way. It's just something that we establish with clarity through proof. In this case, we use logic. So what we're refuting particularly then is this truly existing objects. And that refers also to the, you could say, the subjective dimension. So this is what we refute, and we sometimes refer to this as establishing the selflessness of phenomena as with the objects, and the selflessness of person on the subjective dimension. Now, the reason we're doing this is not to be, you could say, great scientists or great logicians or propounder of the truth, but it's more that this insecurity of clinging to these assumptions is what drives suffering. So the Buddha didn't teach to be right. He taught to eliminate the suffering that there exists in the world. And so when we refute with the Madhyamaka refutation, we're eliminating the root of suffering, which is this dualistic fixation, subject and object. Now today we're going to be looking at how Svatantrika came to Tibet, and there's a lot of, the Tibetans will always quote, I think it's what's it called, the Atikirpa Chempo, the Kempos refer to this. It's a Dzogchen scripture that just establishes that if you're going to have faith in something, you need to know where it came from. And actually we in the West are way more picky about that than Tibetans are. But it's universal. We want to understand a little bit where's the source of all of this. So there's some history in this. So the original Madhyamaka was brought to Tibet with then the masters Shantarakshita and Padmasambhava in the 8th century. So we all know about how Buddhism was brought to Tibet, but very often, actually Shantarakshita is sort of downplayed a bit because we traditionally have to say he pretended not to be able to handle the situation in Tibet, and there were some karmic reasons for this, so that Shantarakshita, when he was establishing Samya monastery, there was obstacles and it seemed he couldn't overcome them with the local spirits, the political situation and so forth, and so they invited Padmasambhava, who subdued all the obstructing forces in Tibet. And then we're familiar with this situation, but the thing is, Shantarakshita was actually a giant. He was a huge authority of Buddhism in India, and he's particularly well known in India as the one who fused the two major Mahayana traditions of Yogacharya and Madhyamaka, and that's what we then end up having, what we call the Yogacharya Madhyamaka, and that's what we basically mean with Svatantrika. And this was then the view that that flourished in Tibet, and this is what was taught to Padmasambhava's 25 disciples. It was taught to the 80 Siddhas, the first generation of Buddhists in Tibet. And this view, the so-called Svatantrika view, was also held by many accomplished masters in India, Saraha, Krishnapada, and so forth. All these accomplished Mahasiddhas, I think the Kempos also say even the 84 Mahasiddhas, they generally held this view. They were they held this Yogacharya Madhyamaka view. So it is also something that's basic when we practice Vajrayana. The terms then, when we say Svatantrika and Prasangika, see, in India people would just say, well, you know, they're Yogacharyas, they're Madhyamikans, and there wasn't really that. There was these two traditions, and so when we then fused the Yogacharya and the Madhyamaka, then that was referred to as the Yogacharya Madhyamaka, and it's only later that then the notion of two different Madhyamikas emerged. There was some disagreements in the Madhyamaka positions within India, like we looked at last time. There's Buddha who had a view, and then Bhavivika, and these are then later referred to as the Prasangika position, and then Bhavivika and Shantarakshita and so forth are referred to as Svatantrika. But they are later designations. But the main point really is that the Madhyamaka then that spread in the Tibet in the early days was then what we call Svatantrika. And at that time, it was just referred to as Madhyamaka. So even though the Prasangika texts, there were some of them that were the Prasangika Madhyamaka, some of it was translated during the early translation period. Some of, I think, Chandrakirti's works were translated, and Buddha Palitas perhaps. Then the main sort of actual study of this practice was of the what's it called? The main Madhyamaka that was taught was then this Svatantrika. So that's what we understood as the Madhyamaka of Tibet. And there is the teacher of Shantarakshita, his name was Jayananda, and he, in fact, does use the word Svatantrika a few places. But he actually, Jayananda, referred to himself as a Madhyamaka. So there's no specifying anything as Prasangika and Svatantrika at that point. Now, Samya was the first. Big monastic college really in Tibet. The second was established by a student of Atisha, and his name was Ngok Lekpe Sherab. Ngok Lekpe Sherab, yes. Now, he had a nephew, and that's the one we're talking about here, Lochen Ngok Loden Sherab. And he went to India, he studied there for many years, he returned, and he became very, very famous. With his teaching, he's had as many as 10 to 20,000 disciples who would be studying with him in one sitting. He would then turn in different directions and teach, but somehow he could hold teaching so many different students. And he then became the second abbot of this famous Sanpu Neotok College. This was established in 1071 in the 11th century, and it flourished all the way down to the 16th century. So Ngok's view, and the view that he spread vastly, was then this Svatantrika view, but it was within the generations that followed him that then the Prasangika view emerged. By the way, I put in a picture here of what Tibetan, when we talk about that many people, 10, 20,000 students, I've here put in a recent picture from a similar situation we have in what's called Larungar, and repeatedly the Chinese authorities have tried to destroy this. Well, they have destroyed it, but they destroyed it in, I think it was 2008. There's several times really, but recently the Larunga was as big as you see it here, just enormous, and I think as many as 8 or 10,000 people living there, basically studying with in the tradition of Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok and his students, his two main students, who are Khenpo Sodaje and Tsultrim Lodra. But you see, that kind of scenario that played out then in the case of Ngok Lochen. Now, Ngok Lochen then had some important students that are referred to here, Drolongpa, Tolongpa, and so on, and also somebody that was known as Chapa Chapas Chögi Senge. And Chapa Chögi, and as part of the culture then, the the Tibetan masters at this time, then they were aware of the works of Chandrakirti. And Chapachugi Singha, he actually wrote a very critical piece on Chandrakirti. But he then had a disciple, Mabjat Sundru Sengye. Sorry, it's not Mabjat, it's Mabja Changchup Sundru, yes. Mabjat Changchup Sundru. And he encountered then the first translation or the retranslation, the translation that we use nowadays was made by somebody called Patsap Nimachak. And Patsap Nimachak then translated the Madhyamaka into Tibetan. And this then, together with Mabjat Changchup Sundru, with him embracing this view, then the teaching of the Prasangika spread throughout Tibet. And it is in fact what is generally accepted by everybody, including the Khenpos that are teaching this, and including the sort of general notion of the Madhyamaka everywhere. It's really Patsap's view, which is regarded as ultimate. But then again, there's a few takes on how this view can be understood. But anyway, just to appreciate that this Svatantrika view was basic to the early days when Buddhism was brought to Tibet, at the time of Padmasambhava and the time of Shantarakshita. And then in the 11th century, Patsap Nimachak, he translates the Madhyamaka and another work by Chandrakirti called the Prasanapada. Now, the Madhyamaka is important for all the students of Tsongtse Gyaltsen Rinpoche because this is the work that Tsongtse Gyaltsen Rinpoche taught on several occasions, one time in Canada, one time in France, and I think one time in San Francisco. Then Rinpoche taught the Madhyamaka and really to introduce the highest view then of the Madhyamaka. And indeed, this is then what all the traditions embraced in Tibet. And this was then Patsap Nimachak, and Mabjat Changchup Sundru that spread this. Now, when we talk about these views, it sounds very philosophical and potentially theoretical. And in fact, this is really just about, you could say, how we understand as you could say, we think about things. But ultimately, the practice itself, once there's some certainty about the nature of dependent arising and emptiness, then the actual application comes down to an appreciation of a dimension of non-thought and samadhi and so forth, settling into equanimity as to the practice of meditation, and that defies ordinary thought as such. And so regardless of where the yogis they might have come from, whether they were Svatantrikas or Prasangikas, well, the general view is that when you practice and you're guided by an accomplished master, then the words are secondary and the yogis would attain accomplishment. So we do have countless siddhas who of the various traditions. But at the same time, when you're understanding, when you're working towards an understanding, and particularly us who live in a culture that thinks very differently, then the reflections and the teachings on the Madhyamaka are very important. Just if you're interested in this particular development in Tibetan Buddhism, there's a really excellent book by Thomas Doctor, and it's called Reason and Experience in Tibetan Buddhism. And you also do have some very well-known works in Tibetology or Buddhology, if you like, such as what's called the Svatantrika Prasangika distinction. And in general, you, as a student of the Great Perfection and the Nyingma teachings and so forth, there's also very important work that's worth looking at, which is Jamgun Mipam's Beacon of Certainty, translated by John Pettit. And this is also what this shows how the Madhyamaka view then is basic to the view and practice of Dzogchen. So these are just to give a little bit of a framework. Let's see here. The Khenpos here, they use a commentary on Shantarakshita's work on the Svatantrika Madhyamaka view, or the Yogacarya Madhyamaka view. And again, like I said last time, this view is very helpful for us who are situated within a modernity that has a what we call a materialist or a mechanistic reductionist view that seems to think that there is an actual objective reality. So to, you could say, refute that or to see through this, it's quite helpful to investigate the Yogacarya view. And so that is what the adornment of the middle way does. It operates with, on the relative level, the Yogacarya view, and on the absolute level, the Prasangika view. So we have this work, the adornment of the middle way, the Madhyamaka Alamkara, and this was a key work then in the early days of Buddhism in Tibet. And also we can assume that some of these commentaries that would have existed at that time, rather that there would have been commentaries at that time, but as far as we have nowadays, it seems that there's only a couple of commentaries really that reach us. One is then the one from Gyaltsab Je, and we have actually a English translation from the late James Blumenthal. He only passed away a couple of years ago, and that's then published in English as The Ornament of the Middle Way, a study of the Madhyamaka thought of Shantarakshita. And then we have two English translations of Jamgon Nipam's commentary, which in Thomas Doctor's edition is referred to as Speech of Delight, and in the Padmakara edition it's called simply The Adornment of the Middle Way, which is actually what Shantarakshita's work was called, but it is also then translated, the subtitle, if you like, is then A Teaching to Delight My Master Manju Gosha. So these two translations of Jamgon Nipam's commentary, they are available. And these that we're drawing on now. But why I also chose this book is because the translations of Thomas Doctor and the Padmakara, they're definitely both very good translations, authoritative translations, but they're also, I'm not sure that many people would actually read these. And I think the Svatantrika view is very helpful. And so this work here, I chose this work here because it's a short presentation. It's a summary digest, if you like, of the Madhyamaka Alamkara, and presents these sort of important points, specifically with regards to the Madhyamaka view. The Madhyamaka Alamkara also covers aspects of pramana, which are quite dense, but here then the Khenpos, they specifically draw on this to explain the Svatantrika Madhyamaka. Okay. Okay, I see there's not any questions at this point, so I'm just going to keep going, but please ask questions. Remember the Chinese, they'll say, ask a question and you might look ignorant for 5 minutes. But don't ask a question and your ignorance stays with you for your lifetime. And it's really important in approaching this that to just clarify. And again, maybe I'm just repeating myself from last time. Maybe it's clear. But also remember that if you ask questions, it's very often there's others who would benefit from your question. Okay. Okay, now as you probably know, when we study Madhyamaka, then we operate with the notion of two truths. And in the Sutra of Meeting of Father and Son, Japsa Javid Do in Tibetan, the Buddha says, or maybe this is, no, this seems to be a student of the Buddha. So there it says, O omniscient one, who knows everything, all-knowing one, you taught the two truths, never before taught by anyone else in the world. And what are these two truths? They are a relative and absolute truth. So this is very important, and in fact we could look at some of the confusion that crops up in Western philosophy. There's some implicit understanding of these two sometimes with some philosophers, but it's actually very often that the the philosophers try to establish some objective absolute truth, and which is so difficult, and ignores that the whole understanding of truth really depends on the subject. We can say all sorts of things philosophically, but if the subject is confused, what does it help? So as far as this so-called truth project is concerned, it so depends on how we see it, depending on who we are. And that's what we call relative truth. But of course, you could say there is some sense that the less the relative or the subject is confused, the more clearer the seeing is. And there is the notion that we could see reality without subjective confusion. And that is then what we're alluding to in terms of absolute truth. So we can say relative truth is the dualistic perceptions, and when we investigate reality, we discover that the apparent solidity and the so-called true identity that we impute on phenomena. We do this. We say, I really like this, I don't like that, me, mine, my ideas, my thoughts. Oh, we take them very seriously. They're very real for us, right? So we attribute solidity. But if we begin to look into their apparent solidity, we find that they're constructs. And that's where we begin to see that, yes, they appear, but they're conditioned. And being conditioned, their nature is not objectifiable. They're empty. So ordinarily, we attribute this delusional solidity, and we have this attraction and repulsion. And that actually what we're doing is we're filtering, we're exerting censorship then, and that prevents us from seeing phenomena as they are. And when we do that, we have the karmas, the kleshas, and so on. We wander in samsara. Now, if we look at a Buddha, we look at a sage, we look at a wise person, they're not caught by these superficial aspects of appearance, and hence they don't begin to censor out and filter reality. They're fearless. And as such, then they see things clearer. They don't get into, I like this, I don't like that. They just look. And that's when they don't, this is then where there's less kleshas, also as a result of less kleshas, then there's less karma, there's no patterning happening, and less, all of this basically comes from recognizing emptiness. And so that's where the sage is liberated. So the sentient being with these dualistic perceptions, they wander in samsara. The sage, seeing through this hoax, they are free. So the absolute truth is the actual nature of phenomena. And now when we look at these two truths, then it's not as if these are some sort of beliefs. They're really just, again, phenomenology. It's about us looking at and applying analysis, reasoning. It's very important that we get beyond this idea of belief. That is just like, oh yeah, I'll say whatever the guru says, I'll just sort of go with it. That's exactly what the Buddha said not to do. This is exactly what the guru says not to do. As far as the looking into investigating reality, what we're doing in the sutra teachings, then that's what we're doing. We're applying analysis. Now, in the Svatantrika Madhyamaka, we apply this idea of some autonomy or self-continuation as far as the certain aspects of our understanding of relative truth and also, to some extent, absolute truth. When we say Svatantra, as in Svatantrika, Sva means self, and Tantra means continuity. So there is basically just that there's something, see, the Prasangikas, they do away with any reference point whatsoever. Whereas the Swatantras, yes, they have a few things to say. And we could well say, well, that's out of compassion, that they posit something, there's some place where there's a common ground of language that they subscribe to. So you could say there's more compassion in this approach. The Prasangikas say, oh, it's much more compassionate to just do away with any reference point whatsoever. And yes, for the advanced students, that's certainly true. But as far as if we look at our experience, then every instance that we experience, this actually is the foundation for the next instance of experience. Again, this already undermines some of the physicalist assumptions around consciousness. And consciousness is not created by unconscious, like matter, like neurons or whatever, neurobiological systems. It's in fact created by these intangible instances of consciousness. And so this is how we establish conventional truth. There's an understanding that cause and effect. Seed, apple seed makes apple fruit, and also a moment of anger creates an ensuing moment of anger, a mood of anger, and so on. A mood of gratitude creates an ensuing mood of well-being, and so forth. Now, as much as all of these things are conditioned, we can say in absolute truth their nature cannot be objectified. We can't grasp them. Their nature is emptiness. And again, the Khenpos keep going on about how this is phenomenology. It is not beliefs. It's not metaphysics. It's not like the Buddhists believe this, that, or the other. It's about us looking into, is this true or not? So we don't accept things blindly, but we analyze and arrive at this. So again, it applies that if we recognize the validity of this, then to ignore it is self-deception. Once we've established that water boils at whatever, 95 degrees in 3,000 meters height, then it's not a belief. So then we just need to accept this is true. Some of us, just because we believe, and I haven't done this experiment. I just knew this from, our physics lessons in school. So I assume that these physicists that wrote these books, they can be relied upon. So that's actually where at that point, I'm actually someone who bases it on blind faith. If I was really critical, I would go in and check it out. I would boil some water at 3,000 feet and see the temperature. But here actually the Buddhist approach is, since the subject matter, the science of what we're dealing with, and the object of science is our own mind, we can actually go in and test that. And we're expected to do that. Go in and see if we can find a self. Go in and see if we can find a truly existing object. We'll find that both the self and the object is something that's a construct. So when we analyze and establish emptiness, we cease to be fooled. We have some vaccination against this assumption. So for example, if we say that this person is my mother, well, we just need to find somebody who's married to her, which would be my father then, and he would say, no, that's not a mother, that's a wife. And we right away know, naturally, that there's no truly existent mother or wife. These are just relative positions. And likewise also, we can discuss pieces of music. Is this a great piece of music, or does it suck? This depends entirely on the persons that are listening to it. And when we begin to understand this also about the things that we like and dislike, when we begin to analyze and see it's not in the object itself that something good or bad lies, then we begin to establish and understand the emptiness of the phenomena. It exists, it appears, but it's something that's conditional. The labels that we attribute to it are just labels. And as far as its subjective existence goes, we can also analyze its apparent solidity, and we find out, no, it's just conditioned by different, a chair is made out of different things, a watch is made up of different things, a person is made up of different things. And likewise, if we go right down to the atomic level, even the atomic particles, they can be seen in terms of subatomic aspects and so on. So all this leads to understanding a greater perspective. We might not like the word emptiness, and it doesn't mean there's nothing there, but it just means that the solidity that we attribute to it doesn't apply. So just like when we attribute solidity to a movie, when somebody says, hey, it's just a movie, it doesn't mean the movie goes away. It just means we cease to be fooled. We cease to be terrified that something's happening. We sort of calm down a bit and go back to our popcorn. So this understanding that we establish, this actually is what, now we're going into something interesting that the Svatantrikas work with, and that's what we call the conceptual or enumerated or categorized absolute. See, we very often, people will say, oh, you could never understand emptiness, it's just the scope of great sages. That's not true at all. We definitely appreciate how the Dalai Lama, how great sages, they have a realization. And that's what we could say a non-conceptual understanding of emptiness. But even so, or a non-conceptual or non-enumerated or non-categorized understanding of the absolute reality. But we also know that we can actually right now understand how, like I was giving the examples before of how we see things different depending on who we are. So that brings about a conceptual or a categorized or enumerated understanding of the absolute. And that's very valuable. And that's essentially what we're doing with this study. We're beginning to have some idea. We're beginning to understand the absolute somehow. And that's very valuable. And conceptual or not, it gives us some certainty and understanding of what we're doing. And so that is where the Svatantrikas, they do more than just say, we have no view whatsoever, we have no position. They actually go in and sort of make an analysis and so on. And that's, you could say, the great value of the Svatantrika approach. As far as this understanding of the absolute emptiness goes, it's not as if there's anything that actually is not empty. And even the idea of emptiness itself, it has no absolute reality. We're just saying that, it's a dream. It doesn't mean that saying that phenomena end or change in any way. It's just that understanding we apply, and that vaccinates us against our grasping. It's not as if there is some great sort of emptiness that needs to be understood. It's simply just the wisdom that sees through the apparent phenomena. It's the wisdom that's not deceived. So that's why when we, for example, in the Heart Sutra, we say, no form, no feeling, etc., and all the way up through the 5 skandhas, through the elements, through the ayatanas, and right up even to wisdom. We say no wisdom, no, and so on, no attainment, all of that. So even all of these phenomena, these are all empty. There's nothing that we can objectify and hang our hat on, so to speak. Now, we need to appreciate that this view is basic to all the various paths that we have in Buddhism. So regardless of what we look at, whether it's the Madhyamaka, or if it's the Mahamudra, or if it's Dzogchen, all of these paths, they operate with the notion of this emptiness, this middle way. And so this also applies then, for example, the teachings of Chöd, the teachings of Lamdre, the teachings on Shije, and all of that. Actually, Tongsa Khenchen Rinpoche has been introducing to students the idea of the five eight lineages, 8 practice lineages, which are then the subject of the Dhammadza, the treasury of scriptural, of precious instructions. And in general, all the various Buddhist traditions that we have in Tibet, the 4 traditions, or then if we talk about the 8, regardless of what these different paths are about, this understanding of emptiness and the middle way is essential for understanding regardless of the path. And so once we apply that, then we actually have what it takes to remove our narrowness of ignorance. That's where we're at ease with whatever is being said. We can be at ease wherever we are in the world. We can be at ease whatever Buddhist practice we're doing, and so forth. And so with that vastness, that vast view, it removes a certain narrowness, and it introduces to this expansive reality, which has to do with, you could say, our own innate natural lack of judgmentality and our own innate capacity for insight and simplicity. So this quality of inner beauty then emerges. And This is also then where the Khenpos then again make a point, as we are touching on this deep and very profound and deeply loving, soft quality of wisdom, and with that also the, you could say, dissolution of the narrowness of self, then naturally this selfless vision is what we mean with the bodhicitta resolve, that we're doing this for all sentient beings. So we should continually come back as we're studying to reaffirm this bodhicitta resolve. To sum up, the middle way, it means that there's nothing that we hold on to. There's no extremes that we fixate on. And when we say extreme in Buddhism, we're not talking about people who do things a lot. It really just means this, that we adopt a position, that we hold on to some fixation. So with the middle way, it's not as if there's the left way or the right way, the wrong way and the right way. It's not as if there's a third way. But it simply means that we don't fixate on anything. And that's what's meant with the middle way. It's very, when you meet people and they're agreeable, you can talk with them, they're not rigid. Well, that's actually the spirit of the middle way. In general, you could say this middle way permeates all the Buddhist teachings. That was just established. And we have then the various ways of understanding this middle way. We have some ways that we apply in the sutra teachings. The Khenpos were explaining about that. We have the approach of the sutra and the mantra way. And as far as the sutra teachings goes, they mention that there's ka, which means the words of the Buddha, and there's shun. Somehow there's a little spelling mistake there. It's not shang, but it's shun, just means commentaries. So when we talk about the middle way in terms of the Buddha and his teachings, the words of the Buddha, then we would refer to the three turnings of the wheel, and that's where the Khenpos then highlight how when we generally refer to the Madhyamaka teaching, it specifically refers to the second turning of the wheel, which are the Prajnaparamita teachings, and then the third turning of the wheel, which is in some way based on the Prajnaparamita and the understanding of emptiness, but also talks about then the Buddha nature. So those of you who are comfortable with Madhyamaka speak, we could say that the second turning of the wheel, this comes with what we call a non-affirmative negation. And that's then what we call the coarse middle way. And this then leads to a greater vision of the middle way, which is then what we refer to as the inner middle way, which then comes with an affirmative negation. This has led to some squabbling in Tibet, what we'd refer to then as the difference between the sort of coarse middle way, the outer middle way, and the inner middle way. And we'll look at that later. And we are in a way lucky that in the 19th century then, based on, like I mentioned before, Rongsun Pandita and Longchenpa, then Mipam Rinpoche established, you could say, a way that sees through all the conflicts that have emerged and the squabbling between these two approaches to the middle way. But it's important for us to appreciate that when we have these teachings from the Buddha, the second and the third turning of the wheel, some on emptiness, some on Buddha nature, that there's not any conflict in these, that they're equally. And that is specific then to the Svatantrika Madhyamaka approach. The second and the third turning of the wheel are equally seen as the Buddha's absolute teachings, what we call the ngedon, or the certain teachings. Then we sometimes also say, as far as the Prajnaparamita goes, that when we have two styles of teaching wisdom, we have it then, again referring to the second and third turning of the wheel, we have the Madhyamaka teachings that were taught by Nagarjuna, and we can say that is the direct meaning of the Prajnaparamita, in the sense that this is what we can, the Madhyamaka teachings, they sort of use logic and reasoning, and it's clearly established then the meaning of the Prajnaparamita. Whereas the Asanga, who then taught the 5 Dhammas of Maitreya, talks more from a subjective and more experiential point of view, and that's where we then talk about the 5 Dhammas of Maitreya as explaining the hidden meaning of the Prajnaparamita. We can to some extent say that Nagarjuna taught the Madhyamaka as, you could say, the objective way of explaining the Prajnaparamita, and the approach of a Sangha with 5 Dhammas is more working on the dimension of the subjective. When we just talk about the Madhyamaka schools, as we talked on last time, we have the Sautrantika Madhyamaka, they have the Svatantrika Madhyamaka, and the Prasangika Madhyamaka. These are then associated with these 3 masters, Bhavivika, who taught the Sautrantika, the Shantrakshita, who taught the Svatantrika, and then Chandrakirti, who taught the Prasangika. Now, these 3 styles, you could say the first 2 is the Sautrantika, which the Sautrantika operates very much with that there still is some atoms and there's something that can be objectified. Whereas the Svatantrika, adopting the Yogacarya view, they more think of, you could say, appearances in terms of mind. But these 2 are then joined as one. So we say the traditions of Madhyamaka, there's 2 mainly. That's mainly what we talk about, namely the Svatantrika, that includes the Sautrantika, and then the Prasangika Madhyamaka. So just to, as we're sort of looking at Madhyamaka, there's these classifications. So let's just make a summary here. And the Svatantrika, they do have some, you could say, autonomous assertion with regards to relative truth. They use some philosophy to understand relative truth. Those of you who studied Introduction to the Middle Way and the Madhyamaka Avatara, you will know that as far as relative truth goes, the Prasangikas don't really say much. It's just whatever they say, whatever the cowherd says, that's fine. Cause and effect, yes, we can see that simple relative truth. They don't really begin to get philosophical. But the Svatantrika, yes, they do talk about how our perceptions are contingent on the mind. And so they do develop a science around our perceptions, and that is where they use the Yogacarya approach. That's as far as relative truth goes. So there the Svatantrika have a particular position. And also the Svatantrikas, they assert then, as far as absolute truth, they assert then a categorized or conceptual understanding, what we talked about earlier, of the absolute. If we analyze phenomena, we can see they really don't have any intrinsic truth value. So the Svatantrikas, they assert that there's a categorized absolute, and also there's the uncategorized absolute, which is realization itself. In some traditions, they don't make this distinction, and that's where the Prasangikas, as much as they call themselves Prasangika, some people might say, I'm a Prasangika Madhyamaka, but if their understanding of the absolute is still just an analysis and just saying, well, there's nothing that you can find if you investigate and so on, they're actually not really having a realization. They're just going into an understanding that can be established intellectually. So that's where you could say the Svatantrika edge is that there is this distinction between whether it's realized or not. Another, you could say, plus for the Svatantrikas. Doesn't mean that we dismiss the Prasangika's approach, which is very cool, but again, then when we do say I have no position, then it should really be something that we realize, and not just something that we establish on the basis of, you could say, parroting certain very simple methodologies of deconstruction. So that's what to be said about today's. Then there is a few questions, and just briefly here going through the questions and answers, which are quite useful. Let me just, by the way, say, everything I say here presumes that you do read the book, because there's things that I leave out, there are things that I sort of change around, and also there are things that I insert which are helpful. For example, in the discussion about the conceptual, what we call categorized and uncategorized absolute, there's the Khenpos allude to this, but it's not actually spelled out. So just with a little bit familiarity of the Svatantrika tradition, I'm inserting this kind of commentary. And I think if you read the book and you listen to the discussion here, this could possibly be a very good, you could say, combination, as with any study, I guess. And also likewise also with the questions and answers here, I'm not going through what exactly they say. I'm just also adding to what the Khenpos are saying. So the question here is, how does the Madhyamaka, that seems very different from the Hinayana, apply? Then the discussion, what's implicit in the answer is really this understanding that Madhyamaka is something that can be understood everywhere. It's the middle way. So it's everywhere in the various yanas. And the Khenpos refer to how in the Hinayana we refer to the middle way as the extreme that does not fall into eternalism through establishing impermanence, which is common to all Buddhist teachings, and also it's not nihilism, because we also talk about that which realizes this impermanence. So there's a middle way there. In terms of sometimes when we talk about the middle way, we also can talk about it in terms of action. If we look at the Buddha's life, he famously adopted the middle way. When we say the middle way there, we're really just talking about in terms of his, if you like, lifestyle, what we would talk about in terms of the behaviorist or the aspect of practice. There you could say the Buddha, he realized how there was one extreme, which was the indulgent luxury of his life in the palace, and there also another one that he rejected was the extreme of asceticism. When he practiced for 6 years, eventually he abandoned that extreme as well. Then also the Khenpos then discuss how the middle way exists within the Chittamatran, because we don't fall into eternalism, because we establish lack of duality. There's neither subject nor object, but at the same time also there is the clarity that emerges through the sort of the clarity or the cognition that recognizes non-duality. So that when you recognize that, what is known as the reflexive awareness, or Ranrik Ransen, the self-illuminating awareness, that's asserted as having some, you could say, the assertion of that establishes the Chittamatra as not falling into nihilism. Then it's clearly not saying there's nothing. They're asserting the clarity of this non-duality. And then there's a question about contemplation. And contemplation here is seen then in the sense of you first hear the teachings, then you contemplate them, or you reflect on them, and then you meditate. So there's 3 prajnas. So as far as contemplation goes, this is essentially what we in our culture would refer to as critical thinking. And once we think about something critically, then we begin to gain some certainty about something we're doing. So for example, if we think about cause and effect, and the Buddha says, oh yeah, there's cause and effect, we might think, oh, the Buddha says that. Well, that's the Buddha's belief. Well, if we think about it, then this is not a belief. Again, we're on to this issue of belief, right? If we look at cause and effect, we have to say, that's actually true. That's a natural fact. It's not a belief. And so that's where contemplation establishes a far greater understanding. And when we also begin to take that into deeper levels, for example, we look at our own mind and we see cause and effect in there, or we can also begin to understand how consciousness operates and is not, you could say, conditioned by physical factors, then we can infer things like past and future lives. We can see consciousness is not conditioned in the way that we ordinarily think it is. And so even though we can't see past and future lives, if we apply inferential cognition, if we think about some of the teachings around these, the nature of consciousness, then we can also begin to understand things that we might not see right away. Inferential cognition is really just that we We think about things, and then our understanding leads us to understanding things that we might not directly perceive, but we also can see truths about these situations. Traditional image about inferential cognition is the smoke that we see, and we can't see the fire, but thanks to seeing the smoke, we can infer that there is a fire. Now, once we have contemplated, then we arrive at a certainty, and that's where we then begin to meditate. We can, for example, see, hey, there is anger, and there is attachment, and there's all the various kinds of things that the Buddha talks about. And if we think about it, we go, hey, that's actually true. What am I going to do about that? Well, perhaps not believe every thought that we think. And that's where we then proceed to meditate. So, so that's the value of contemplation. And also, as the Khenpos point out, debate, as you have in monasteries, is also a form of contemplation. If you debate things, you arrive at clarity around something. You might have something that you debate, and we do this a lot, in fact, in our culture. We're constantly debating, and that's a very valuable way of arriving at, you could say, an informed position. We can be informed persons. We debate, we question, and we arrive at a greater clarity. So, again, apologies for going a little bit over time here. Let's see if there's any questions. Yay, there are some. Should we start by studying the Madhyamaka view and find out if we have the understanding to follow that, or just start with the Svatantrika? I would say do both at the same time. There's a lot of teachings on the Prasangika around. I would warmly recommend to study them. And particularly then I'm thinking of Tsongsa Gyaltsen Rinpoche's teachings on the Madhyamaka, which Rinpoche made very accessible. So really, yeah, both of them together. Is a rock a rock? Oh, definitely. In our ordinary world, we would say yes. Somebody points to a rock and say, "Is that a rock?" Then we're going to say, "Yeah, that's a rock." And then if somebody says, "But what is a rock really?" And every time we use those WH words, why, what, and so on, then we begin to apply analysis. And that's where we begin to see, well, what is a rock really? Well, there's different kinds of rock. There's slate, there's granite, and so on. We begin to discover complexity. And that's where the rocks is, you could say, quickly seen to be more complex than it appeared. Now, rocks don't generally precipitate strong, you could say, suffering. It's just pretty much there. But some of the phenomena that we attribute solidity, the person that we like or dislike. Now that's where we begin to analyze there. Then we begin to see the complexity of it. And that's where we begin to get a greater view. Greater view ensures us against suffering. We begin to understand that it's complex. Things are not how they appear. So this question is not really philosophical, but very much has to do with what it is that drives our happiness and suffering. Does your first bullet point Svatantrika in this case refer to both Svatantrika and Svatantrika, or just the Svatantrika? Well, actually, as we saw earlier, we join the Sotrantika. We join them under the heading of Svatantrika. Like Bhaviveka's position was what we call the Sotrantika position, which has you'd say, materialist leaning, with the Svatantrika, which also has some, you could say, substantialism in its explanations, but is more than tied up with an understanding of the mind. But in this case, then, our general understanding then is that the Svatantrika is subsumed under the heading of Sotrantika. Now, or is the Sotrantika more about relative truth existing as per atoms, but not like being created by mind? Yes, exactly, that's it. Yes, so it's not Sotrantika, but it's Sotrantika. It actually comes from sutra. So we say it's like the sutra tradition we have in the various philosophical schools of Buddhism. We talk about four major schools. One is the Vaibhashika and the Sautrantika. So the Sautrantikas are the ones that then operate with the idea that there are actual atoms out there. And then there's somebody who says, can we see the slides afterwards? Yes. If you go into, and when I send out the, the link for the registration, there's also a Dropbox link there. And if you click on that, it'll take you into a Dropbox folder where you can see it says audio, video, and reading. So as far as the slides go, they're under video. That's where you see a recording of this webinar, just like a regular little, you could say, video. And you also, if you just want to listen to the recording, then there's MP3 in the audio folder. Good. I'm glad if this is helpful. So thank you very much for joining me once again for this study, and we'll dedicate the merit then. Oh yeah, by the next time, read then until to and including page 69. By this merit may all attain omniscience, may defeat the enemy wrongdoing, from the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness and death, from the ocean of samsara, may all beings be freed. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but grow and increase ever more and more. Thank you.